Okay, so this is our first part of the tall to small project. We're dealing with a system called linear perspective. It's a system that was invented during the Renaissance to help artists create more convincing senses of space, specifically linear architectural geometric space. So the first thing you got to know is my paper the same format or proportion as the image that I'm drawing from? And you can see that my paper is taller relative to its width than the image. The image is a little squarer in its height to width proportion. So we got to figure out how to make our page the same proportion. So I just measure corner to corner angles, and I check my angles and I refine them. I look to see if that guess is good, and if it's not, I stumble around with my iPad and I draw my X across it to really check, because this is important. Everything, and you can see I was too steep. So I bring that angle down a little bit, and where it crosses the page is where that horizontal line at the top of the page is going to be. I draw this other angle. Do they match up? Yeah, pretty good. Does that look like the right proportions? Well, it looks a lot closer. I'm not sure that it is. Sometimes I just like to observe the triangular shapes and see if they're the same. It looks a little bit shallower, a little bit lower in height, but it's better, so I'm going to go for it. Remember, we can always correct later. The next thing to consider is that there are two types of lines in perspective. There's lines that run in the same direction as the direction you're looking, i.e. your line of sight. And there's lines that are perpendicular. And in order to determine the right scale of the objects relative to your composition, i.e. how big things are relative to your page, you have to start in linear perspective with the plane that is perpendicular to your line of sight and farthest away. And that would be the opening. The walls run parallel with your line of sight, the opening perpendicular. So I just draw some diagrammatic lines to indicate where I think the bottom and the top of that archway are. I use the corners of the page to try to determine that point through triangulation. I kind of visualize, what is the shape of that rectangle? Where's its center? And I draw two triangulation lines there to check. Do those lines look like they're the same angle? Well, let's go ahead and make a guess and say that they are, and see if it looks like the same proportion triangle. Looks too fat to me, too wide relative to its height. So what do? Well, I know it's wrong. I don't retriangulate. I just bring it in so it looks more similar in its height than width, skinnier, and it does. The next thing is to determine where the vanishing point is. My guess is that it's just to the left of center, but a guess is not always the best way of starting when you are using a formula. So to make sure that my guess is correct, I lay in some lines, not on the perpendiculars, and here in this image you can see the perpendiculars, the edges of the doors, not the tops or the bottoms. The edges of the arch, not the floor lines or the grid on the floor of stones. But the lines that are parallel are the lines that we're looking for. Parallel lines, again, run in the direction of your line of sight. And your line of sight ends on the vanishing point. So these blue lines are perpendicular, horizontals, and verticals. They almost always are horizontal or vertical. The parallel lines are almost always diagonal. So if I draw on those parallel lines, you'll notice they all converge on that single point, known as the vanishing point. I know this is going by quickly. Perpendicular lines. They tend to be horizontal or vertical. Parallel lines are usually diagonal, but finding that vanishing point is crucial. Here you can see I've added dots to the sides of the tops and bottoms of the doors, the tops and bottoms of the rows. We can either triangulate to find those tops and bottoms, or we can find their angle and see if it matches with the point where they exit the page. And this is just like measuring a box. You're using your device to measure the angle, and it should terminate on the vanishing point if your vanishing point is in the right place. If it isn't, you need to move your vanishing point. I'm drawing that perpendicular horizontal archway. And I notice that the other wall ends directly across from the wall on the left. So all I have to do is draw a horizontal line across, and I know that that's where that wall ends. And again, I just move from that point, lay a ruler on the vanishing point and on that point, and draw the line that I see. And it'll give me the correct angle. So there's always 2 or 3 ways to check yourself. Okay, at this point I'm going ahead and I'm just going into a tonal hatching, very loose, very gestural. Just trying to refine the gray sides of the opening versus the very bright opening itself. Incidentally, that bright opening is the lightest area of the whole composition. So everything else in the composition is light gray or darker. That move you see me making here is me comparing the distance between the top of that horizontal architectural feature, the distance from the floor to the bottom of it, and the distance of the top of it to the top of the arch. And they look roughly equal. Now I'm trying to find the edge of that first doorway. How thick is that doorway in proportion? So I take 2 points that I know, the bottom corner of the right wall and the front corner of the right wall. I draw in an angle until it crosses my perspective line, and I draw a line up. And I darken it in because it's dark, just to see, is it the right height or width, pardon me. Then I find the top of the door by triangulating. Check my angles. Looks pretty good. Check to see if that doorway actually goes to the vanishing point like it should. And it does. Have to adjust it just a tad. And then I darken it in. There's a feature there at the top. It's like an overhang. It also goes to the vanishing point. And notice that its end, its side, is vertical because it's perpendicular. Now I'm measuring the distance of the door relative to the distance of the space between that door and the following door. And they're roughly the same. It's a little wider. Then I find the top of the next door. Now what you'll notice is that I can just draw that line all the way to the vanishing point because each door, the top horizontal that is parallel with your line of sight, is angled towards that vanishing point. Now I'm comparing that to the distance of the next door, and that next door seems to be about half of the first door. And so on. So I'm comparing each subsequent door's width to the previous door. And I think darkening them in helps, not only because it advances your drawing to a higher state of resolve, but it also just makes you more aware of where you are and more clear about the proportions and the shapes that you're dealing with. Now I'm measuring the next door compared to the previous door, and so forth and so on, making little marks. Those sides of the door jamb are always going to be vertical unless the door is leaning, but they're not. And that's because they're perpendicular to your line of sight. Only the tops and the bottoms of the doors are going to be angled towards the vanishing point because they're parallel with your line of sight. Sorry, my head's blocking your way. My head blocks a lot of things, including my ability to think clearly sometimes. Now, as you get back towards the end, it becomes very hard to see, which is okay, because that's going to help with the space in your drawing. So if you're not perfect, or if you're frustrated, just give up on it. Move on to something else, like this big pipe that's above everything. Then I noticed this shadow, in that it's above the third doorway. So I draw a line up from the third doorway, and I shade it in. And while I'm at it, I put a light gray wash over that whole surface, knowing that my only white is in the background. Now I'm going to start dealing with these floor tiles. So I draw a line across with my eye, and I look, where does that floor tile touch the doorway? Because I know where the doorway's in the good spot. And I guess where that dark mark is. And I find the vanishing point relative to the first floor line. And then I decide to work on that arch a little more, because the arch is bothering me. I think it's too short. Then I draw a line for the floor to the vanishing point. Make sure it's correct. Next line, parallel line, where is it? Is it touching the page on the lower right-hand corner in the same space? So I'm making guesses. Looks a little wide to me. A little short, so I adjust. Now notice that those center lines of those tiles that are right in front of you where you're standing are almost vertical because they're in line with your line of sight. Even though they're parallel, they're going to be vertical like perpendiculars are. But that's only because they're directly underneath your eye, right in front of you. Now I compare the next set of tiles and its height to the previous set of tiles and its height. You can use triangulation. Where does it touch the door on the left or the page on the right? Or you can simply compare. Again, getting frustrated, so I just do some washes and some shading. It's always good to balance yourself between this very logical, scientific, formulaic art or approach to linear perspective and the other stuff that needs to get done, like shading, which is a little more intuitive, a little bit more free. Notice that I'm not drawing every stinking tile that's on the floor. Why? Because I can't see every tile. Now I'm working on that right wall. Something feels wrong to me. And it's here that I discover that my page, or my guess for the proportions of my page relative to the format that I'm drawing from, are slightly off. And that's throwing off the arch, and it's going to throw off some of the perspective in that right wall. You can see me measuring again that same relationship. So I extend the arch upway. That narrows it a little bit. I reorient refine the shape of it using my eraser and my pencil. keep it loose, draw in that horizontal cross beam. Now the proportions feel a little better to me. Something still feels wrong about this right side of the drawing, though. I'm not sure what it is. I start by trying to squeeze in all of those doorways, those vertical door jambs, into the triangle of the perspective of that wall. But something is off. I don't know what it is yet. So I start from the opposite end and try to work my way forward towards the edge of the page. So I decide to make a radical move. I go ahead and crop in on the right side of the page. I think that my page has been too wide the whole time. I miscalculated the proportions. In frustration, I do a little bit more shading and then come back to trying to fit these doors in. And sure enough, I get much better proportion now that I've decreased the width of my page. So that's the battle, and this is about where we should be for our next class. Remember, keep it loose, keep willing to change things that are wrong, and we'll be ready to go when we meet again.